Greetings, I'm Hurt Castro, coming to you from our state-of-the-art Suspension Development Center in Colorado Springs. Today, we're going to learn how to install 4 types of cranks and bottom brackets: power spline, ISIS, Giga X-pipe or GXP, and howitzer. Here are the 5 steps. First, prep the frame. Second, prep the bottom bracket. Third, install the bottom bracket. Fourth, install the crank. Unless you've done this many times before, we sure do recommend that you check out these SRAM product manuals, which are on the SRAM website as PDFs. Please print these out and read through them before you put your bike in the stand. Okay, enough preliminaries, let's get down to business. Make sure that the frame's bottom bracket shell threads are clean and undamaged. There should be no paint or dirt present. For best results, the shell should be chased and faced before bottom bracket installation. Next, we're going to grease the cup and shell threads and choose the necessary spacers depending on the shell width and chainring configuration. We're working with a howitzer BB here. For ISIS and power spline, the steps will be the same except that the bottom bracket is a 2-piece assembly versus the howitzer's 3-piece. For GXP, most of the steps will be the same, with the obvious exception that the drive side crank arm is fixed to the spindle. Okay, so let's install this bottom bracket in the frame. Carefully thread the right side bearing cup with spindle and sealing tube into the frame and then torque it to 25 to 30 foot-pounds with a Truvative or Park installation tool. For ISIS and power spline, the bottom bracket is a 2-piece unit. So at this point, install the bearing and spindle assembly into the drive side and torque it to 25 to 30 foot-pounds. For GXP, the spindle is fixed to the drive side crank arm, so you will not need to install the spindle at this time. Just the bearing cup and sealing tube. Torque the bearing cup to 25 to 30 foot-pounds. Note that on nearly all frames, the right side adapter and BB shell are left-hand thread. These threads are fine, so make sure everything's properly aligned before applying force. Next, in goes the left or non-drive side bearing cup and any needed spacers. Torque this to 25 to 30 foot-pounds as well. The same goes for GXP. For ISIS and power spline, install the non-drive adapter and torque it to 25 to 30 foot-pounds. For GXP, you can now install the spindle and drive side crank arm by carefully pushing the spindle through the bottom bracket from the drive side, being careful not to damage the bearing seal. Push until the spindle comes through the non-drive bearings and stops. Now, you need to grease the spline surfaces of the spindle, the faces of the crank stops, and the crank bolt threads to prepare the bottom bracket for crank arm installation. Finally, the last step is to install the crank arms and tighten the crank bolts. Some crank bolts have a washer permanently installed, some have a separate washer, and some don't use a washer at all. Once you've installed the crank arms to the spindle, thread in the crank bolts and torque them to spec. 40 foot-pounds for howitzer, 35 to 40 foot-pounds for GXP, 32 to 35 foot-pounds for ISIS drive interface, and 28 to 31 foot-pounds for power spline. Make sure that the crank arms bottom against the bearing races or stops completely. If they do not, remove them, reapply grease to the spindle, and reinstall the crank arms. The crank arms are installed completely when there is no visible gap between the crank arms and the bearing races or stops. For GXP, you only need to make sure the non-drive crank arm is making contact with the bearing race stop. That's all there is to it. Your crank and bottom bracket are now ready for action.